Hello and welcome to the Expert Voice. Recent news reports about Panama Papers have shed light on offshore banking and how the rich hide their money. To learn more about this, we have invited Dr. Harry Verhoeven, Professor of Global Political Economy and African Politics at Georgetown University in Qatar. Dr. Verhoeven, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Are the Panama Papers really as important as media claim they are?
I think they are. Not necessarily because of the list of people that is mentioned there, though that in and of itself is quite indicative of how widespread practices of both tax evasion and tax avoidance are. But above all, what they hint at is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a much wider range of law firms and financial institutions that in many ways have systematically created a kind of shadow global economy in which huge amounts of money are stashed away far beyond the reach of treasury services all around the world. And that in and of itself, of course, undermines the capability both of industrialized economies to maintain their welfare states, but also of developing economies to pay for a number of vital services that their citizens urgently require. So in that sense, the fact that we're only talking about one particular Panamanian law firm is extremely suggestive that there's an awful lot more out there that we really should be knowing about and that our national treasury should be focusing on.
What do the revelations found in the Panama Papers tell us about the global economy and the age we live in?
Well, they tell us an awful lot because one of the most important things they tell us is the taxation base that most of our governments use to essentially sustain their activities and undertake certain initiatives is extremely skewed towards hardworking people and towards the middle class and the lower classes, whilst the top end of people and the top end of firms are hardly paying any taxes whatsoever. And so the ability of both big multinationals as well as private individuals to escape the tax man and not at all to pay their fair share, even though in many cases you would expect them to be taxed at higher rates than ordinary people or ordinary small and medium-sized businesses. I think that in and of itself is a huge indictment of the way in which our economy, particularly over the last 30 to 35 years, our global economy, has been skewed. And so this entire language of deregulation and the growing financialization of the global economy is a boost for the economy as a whole and is a boon for all of us ultimately, I think is in many ways being critically undermined by these revelations. It's something that many of us have long known about. What the Panama Papers help us to do is to highlight just how big these distortions are and how much money there is out there and how many people there are out there who are not paying their fair share and thereby undermining the ability of states to do what they should be doing.
Dr. Verhoeven, what might be the political fallout of these Panama Papers?
Well, I think the political fallout could be quite significant because I think the moment that people wake up to the fact that we are talking here about hundreds of billions of US dollars that have been either kept from taxmen or treasuries through tax avoidance or tax evasion is quite significant. I mean, take the example of the United States of America. Tax evasion and tax avoidance in the United States of America is estimated at anywhere around 500 billion US dollars, possibly more. Now that is almost the equivalent of the entire budget of the Pentagon for 2015-2016. So you understand at a time when there's so much social exclusion in the United States, when there's such a shortfall to finance the budget or in healthcare, Medicaid, etc. This is, I think, going to put further momentum behind those voices like Donald Trump on the right and Bernie Sanders on the left, who are arguing that the system is fundamentally rigged and needs to be fundamentally overhauled. Particularly because these revelations were not just something of last week, but they're going to keep coming out over the next few weeks and months as these journalists, this consortium of journalists that has published the papers, is going to be publishing more details on a number of individuals. In that sense, I think therefore it will strengthen calls for a fundamental overhaul, a fundamental transformation of the US economy and very particularly of its tax base by candidates on the left and on the right. And it's not just going to be something that you could wish away or say now we can go back to business as usual.
What lessons should governments learn from these Panama Papers and what actions should they take?
Well, I think this, as I said, points to a very huge problem. And the way in which the financialization of the global economy, and of course of many small national economies that make up that global economy, has not been a positive good. So in many ways, I think that this really calls for urgent action on the part of the government to re-regulate the financial sector and to make a lot of these actions both illegal, but also much harder to implement. And very importantly, it also points to the great necessity to actually broaden the tax base and to go after a number of entirely legal practices, but practices that are hugely damaging to national economies and to the tax bases we have. I give you an example of the practice of transfer pricing. The mechanism of transfer pricing essentially ensures that multinationals that are, for example, based in Belgium or France or the Netherlands pay an effective tax rate of 3%. And they do this by manipulating financial transfers between different subsidiaries of multinationals, which means that it's actually small and medium-sized enterprises that pays most of the corporate taxation, not the high-end multinationals. Now, this very clearly is an unfair practice. It creates a distortion in the economic landscape. And addressing this would not just be good for overall competition policy. Above all, it would allow governments to have a greater amount of revenue available to address the very urgent social and environmental and economic needs that both Western economies face, but also very, very much, of course, developing economies in places like Africa or South Asia or Latin America.
Professor Verhoeven, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
This has been The Expert Voice, brought to you by Georgetown University in Qatar.